Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the MillerKnoll Insight series online. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the MillerKnoll Insight Group. In case you don't know, MillerKnoll is a family of brands. You can see all those brands in front of you. And all these brands design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they get healed, where they learn, and where they work. And today we're definitely looking at the subject of work, but I'm pretty sure it could be applied to designing for everyone. Josh is the urban strategy lead for an organization called Centric. And I'm going to hand over to Josh, who's our speaker today, and he can tell you a lot more about the Centric Lab. Josh, over to you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak to everyone here on the call. It's a pleasure to be here. So maybe you can see a small picture of me. This is a slightly bigger picture of me. I think it's always good to let people know who you're speaking with rather than just this little sort of icon in the corner. And we can get to questions about Biggie at the end if you want, but that is our little bulldog who we live with out here in South Wales. So I'm the urban strategy lead at Centric Lab. That means my focus is looking at the built environment and urban systems and how they relate to health. And health is going to be the underpinning in how we have a conversation today, or a bit of a presentation, a conversation about the neurodiversity movement and how it relates to the workplace. And I'm going to include the workplace, and I know people semantically break that down in a few ways, but the workplace to me is the entire concept of the employment system. So that's everything from where someone works, the design of the features, including how they're treated. And so we're going to look quite holistically in a systemic way about the role of the workplace. So what do we do at Centric Lab? We do a few things. We've been going since 2017. We're a small organisation. We'd like to stay that way. But we partner with a number of UK academic institutions, such as the University College London, where we can work with scientists specialising in fields of neuroscience, in fields of epidemiology, as well as things like spatial design and other factors that are important to our work. So what we do as an organisation, we, as it says on the screen, we prototype ways of using health-based scientific evidence to support justice movements. And the core kind of USP of our work is the use of neuroscience. I'll get to how we focus on neuroscience, and we also combine that with sort of policy work, which is a lot of my area, as well as environmental data. And our outputs are typically open access community tools, new narratives around framings of health. And what we do is we provide organizations with expertise. So I guess some of the things just to cover off, for example, a new tool might be working with communities to design health impact assessments, which is a way of kind of quantifying and qualifying the impacts of a policy change or maybe a large urban development in an inner city neighborhood. So we have a toolkit designed to help communities and local authorities and other stakeholders work on that. We're also doing something around the determinants of health, a big framework to help policy drivers and big strategists understand all those contributing factors that build up towards health. Other things that we do is we design digital tools. So, and I'll show you some of the illustrations from the screen at the top. So how do we use things like environmental data to get a better understanding of how places can either contribute or have a negative impact on health? And we have an online program. And I guess more towards the built environment, we've worked with organisations such as the Greater London Authority to look at environmental conditions in London, as well as work with leading global development organisations such as Grosvenor Americas. This is a scheme we worked with them, providing some strategic insights as they were putting together the master plan for a scheme in Washington, DC, and we've worked across different geographies and different scales of that work. So I said the word justice earlier, and you're like, uh-oh, here we go, another woke guy. And I think, yes, this is always true. I saw this tweet, it cracked me up completely, and I feel it's very true. And I think there is something is important to have a sense of humility here about the complexity of a topic and almost the privilege and the supposed entitlement to talk about something. So I'm going to be very, hopefully, honest and clear that I'm here talking as someone from Centric Lab. We do have a specialism within understanding neurodiversity, in particular with autism. A number of our scientists have a specialism from their education in the field of autism. And so I'm kind of talking with the work that we have produced. I'm not talking about everyone who's done everything and everything out there. So this is just me talking with you guys, someone who's worked in the built environment, around the built environment, in how we're approaching this. But I would always encourage you to, when coming across a big topic like this, to ensure that you do your own reading. So I think my intent today is to kind of build on this statement here, which may seem slightly contrived or contrite in a certain way. And I guess you could look at this statement and speak to one of your software engineers who you might work with or know. And they might say, well, actually, yeah, once we've found the bug in the code, it's very easy to solve. The trick is actually kind of knowing where that bug might be. And they might have tactics to scroll through pages and pages and pages of digital software code in order to find it. And arguably, when you speak to many people who work in that sector, they'll say that actually what they're hired for is their ability to identify these problems, to have very clean code, and to know who to speak with in their team to resolve these problems, because problems do come up. So I guess my intent today is to help you understand the problem. And the problem is, effectively, we have a culture of workplace design that can be disabling and exclusive, as in to exclude people within the neurodiversity space. So there's three sections to this conversation that we're going to have. The first is I'm going to talk about what is neurodiversity. Then we're going to go into sort of the science behind health and place, and using science as a framework to understand people who are neurodivergent helps us give a more what we call ecological, a more holistic, a more environmental assessment about how to provide the right type of employment opportunities and spaces of people who are neurodivergent. And then at the very end, we're going to go through some examples about how it relates to the employment and workspace sector. So starting off. It's a bit awkward, that, isn't it? We don't really do this much. Well, certainly we try not to do this much anymore. And that's because over time, we've realized that stereotyping is an incorrect and illegitimate way of working and interacting with people. And in fact, in the UK, we have what's called the Equality Act. Came out in 2010, and to protect characteristics such as age, disability, gender, etc., so that we don't end up saying such and such people are good at. Because what you do is you then limit a person, stereotype them, and in many ways you can be genderist, racist, ableist, etc. And a lot of this work, and the reason that we don't say this and we don't do this in life, is because of the work of people who've kind of come before us, people such as those in the disability justice space, who have advocated that the issues around disability is not that people are disabled that makes their life difficult. It's the fact that we have designed a world for one type of being, a highly able, often male, often white, fully physically capable way of living. And we can see that in the design of many cities. For example, Manhattan, originally designed for people to be commuting in and out from places like Connecticut, which requires strong physical access to be able to walk distances, to be able to easily have the ergonomics to be on trains and then catch automobiles, etc. So when we're talking about neurodiversity and the role of not stereotyping, it's very important to understand who has come before. So we have people working in the disability justice space, but we also have those who are working in other spaces around social justice. In particular, we can always refer to the Combahee River Collective, as it says on the screen there. a group of Black feminists who worked in the 1970s to identify the multiple intersecting issues that in particular Black women who maybe didn't conform to the typical gender roles of the time may face a series of societal prejudices that resulted in experiencing social injustice as well as health inequities. Now, I'll put a pin there because I'm going to refer to that last bit a little bit more, and you'll see that orange pin in the top right-hand corner as a kind of a note of we might come back to this. And so it's always important to recognize who has come before, because when talking about the neurodiversity space, it is a social movement and it builds on the work of people who have come before. And what we need to recognize, and this is Judy Singer, who coined the term in the 1990s, is someone who'd been a long-term advocate and researcher in the space. And so we can see that neurodiversity, that word, neurodiversity, is a movement and a community that advocates for equitable inclusion in all aspects of society, including employment. And I think it's important here that a person cannot be diagnosed with neurodiversity. It is an identifier that they choose. I think focusing on that terminology is always very important. So here we have neurodiversity as a framework for understanding human brain function that recognizes the diversity of human cognition. And that's the movement. Neurodivergent is a person whose cognitive functioning is different. So I've just got a couple notes here that I think it's important to kind of read out to understand actually what neurodiversity is and its history. So some neurodiversity advocates and researchers have argued that the neurodiversity paradigm is the middle ground between a strong medical model and a strong social model. And some recent studies have indicated that high levels of masking, and I'll get to that in a moment, are generally associated with poorer mental health conditions amongst autistic people. Similarly, some researchers and advocates argue that medicalizing the concept of neurodiversity can create a stigma in people. And the persistent focus on it being a biological function is at odds with those who actually live with a sense of neurodivergence. For example, I mentioned masking just a moment ago. And masking is something that often people who are either an autistic person, or maybe they say they're on the autistic spectrum disorder, or people who have quite heavy attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD. And it's a conscious or unconscious suppression of a range of domains in order to try and survive in a neurotypical world. So that is where people are perceiving a world around that they know is different to how they interact with it, and yet they contrive to try and fit themselves within it. And many people will do this on a daily basis, but that itself can actually require a lot of everything around mental energy. And we're going to talk about the issues around people who are neurodivergent from the lens of health and understanding the role of burnout. That actually our job in this employment sector is to ensure that people do not face burnout and fall out of the employment ecosystem by providing workplace-like environments that are enabling, ones that encourage people to stay within the employment sector and to not fall out. Once people often fall out of the workplace sector, especially if they're on the autism spectrum, it's very hard to actually re-enter. And you find people having to seek other employment as a means of survival because they've been excluded. And I think when we talk about stereotyping, I put up a slide earlier about the role of saying, oh, autistic people are good at computers. There are kind of two ways in which we've stereotyped that in society. And what we've kind of put forward at Centric is the idea that are people who happen to be on the autism spectrum disorder, and as a spectrum, like light, it has many elements to it. Is it that they are good at computers, or is it the fact that because of disabling and very sort of normative or neurotypical structures, they have been forced to find an area of work in which they can feel safe and secure? It doesn't necessarily mean that they are better at it, but it is the place in which they find the comfort because they are excluded from elsewhere. And in order to survive in society, maybe have doubled down because of the feelings of inadequacy the levels of depression and anxiety that run in line with people who are neurodivergent is very high. And so the fear of being seen as inadequate can sometimes compound and mean that they work twice as hard, but have twice as difficult mental health issues. And so it's important to not stereotype and assume that someone is just good at computers. I think the second factor about stereotyping in particular is, when we talk about computers, is actually, I mentioned Judy Singer, who I think it was 1992 who came up with the term neurodiversity. And I was still a young kid in 1992, but many people will be aware that in the 1990s, we had the advent of the World Wide Web, the ability to communicate with people and share information around the world. And as such, when we find a group of people who have been essentially excluded from sort of neurotypical society, interacting with the World Wide Web, it also came at a time where a number of different sort of writers and people who were neurodivergent, in particular those who were autistic, started communicating on the internet as a way to document and to share and to archive and to discuss. How do you feel? Am I feeling this? Are you feeling this? Are we alone? And we actually had organizations and chat rooms like autistics.org and Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse start to come up. And I think towards the 2000s, blogging became a typical way of sharing and documenting. And eventually the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network was started, and further within the neurodiversity movement started to recognize that it was related to the wider sort of disability movement. So I think it's very important that before we approach any topic, and especially something that involves both mental health relationships as well as physical health relationships, that we understand the topic of that we're dealing with. I'm going to focus mostly the conversation around those elements there in bold. Neurodiversity as a movement encompasses all those who are perhaps not neurotypical, as we said before. But I think for the avoidance of doubt, and I think for the avoidance of the importance of honesty, focusing this talk, and I think the topic of neurodiversity and the workplace needs to focus around those ones in bold. And actually, I will get to a piece of work that we put out that is a takeaway for everyone. It was a project we were commissioned by the British Council for Offices to produce, and it's from which we have based most of the analysis and research around. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of the background. What is neurodiversity? How do we understand it and talk about it? How can we rationalize it and understand its history in order to understand what is it that people go through? So this is often kind of the fun part that people like to hire us to talk about. Our lab particularly specializes in what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not going to confuse you, hopefully, or baffle you with different terminologies, but I'm going to try and communicate what this system is and how it relates to the world around us. So many people often assume that neuroscience is just the study of the mind. And I think that's the dominance of modern psychology, and the unfortunate dominance of people like Freud, who've always talked about the subconscious, etc., and the idea that neuroscience is there to unlock the subconscious. I mean, that's not true. Neuroscience is a full body system, a way of understanding the full body, and it's the brain really as part of the central nervous system. The HPA axis, which is what you see on the screen, is what our lab of scientists focus on. And it's, as you can hopefully read, it's a neuroendocrine system that helps regulate reactions to stress in the body, and it has a relationship to digestion, so our metabolic system and how we store energy, how we digest food, looking at the immune system, so our susceptibility to falling ill, and our emotions in particular as well as our hormonal system, so the endocrine side of our hormonal system. So it's a naturally occurring system. It's something that we need to survive and have survived forever. For example, if this was running towards us, our HPA axis would engage and it would produce the necessary hormones and chemicals, etc., to pump maybe adrenaline through the body and cortisol so that our muscles fly quicker. They move faster, we can escape, we can act very quickly. It's a naturally occurring function where our body senses a change in stimuli in the environment and has a consequence and a response. However, this also applies to environments like these, many of the cities in which employment opportunities arise. And it doesn't just have to be New York City, it can be secondary or tertiary cities, anywhere in which there is the exposure to things such as fast-moving vehicles, the noise associated to it, even the air pollution, as well as the struggles around the city, such as the perceptions of inequality or the experience of an inequity. And so what we at Centric have been identifying is that actually there are environmental factors that engage that stress response system. The idea of air, noise, light, and heat, but also our stress response system is engaged through the other sort of mental elements of a city, such as I mentioned before, discrimination, marginalization, fear, safety. For example, the exposure to crime or the perception that you're going to be exposed to crime, housing inequality. Effectively, these kind of different psychological factors that are you call psychosocial stressors, which are stresses you perceive that you are unable to escape from, yet they weigh on you. And I think any of us who've been through a different sort of, I guess, mental health experience of not being able to know where we might live, or if our mortgage costs have dramatically increased and we are stressed, well, that is your body going through a physiological response. But again, and I put a pin in a slide earlier talking about the Combahee River Collective, who talked about the different challenges, the intersecting challenges. And they were one of the earliest groups of people to coin the term intersectionality, something we regularly know in many frameworks that are used around the world. But in the 90s, on the screen, you'll see Professor Arlene T. Geronimus, who was trying to understand why was it that there were disproportionate worse health outcomes for particular African-American women and those who were mothers, and often those who were single working mothers. And her research concluded that there was a form of weathering on their central nervous system through those intersecting pressures and stresses on their system, those exposures to poor work conditions, the marginalizations, arguably the racism that they would have experienced in different ways, and the challenges that it was to be often a woman in America. And so the weathering hypothesis is an underpinning to understand how those mental health stresses start to cause a wear and tear on a naturally occurring system. If we're all in the built environment here, we understand sort of a fair wear and tear on floors when we rent an office, and there's an understanding of that. But after a period of time, that fair wear and tear becomes actual impact and change. And the only problem with our biological systems is it's very hard to repair. And this is also the work of someone like Professor Robert Sapolsky, who not only gives me great beard envy, but is a leading neuroendocrinologist working at Harvard. Whose focus on the intersection of stress as a result of sort of societal structures has an impact on our physiological system. And his way in particular is to look at the experiences of poverty. And I'll get to that kind of point in relation to people who are neurodivergent in a moment. I also will provide a link to a brilliant podcast that Professor Sapolsky has done with a journalist called Ezra Klein, and I'll provide the link where he talks about that a little bit further. But what I've kind of tried to talk about here is the idea that our health is influenced by our exposure to environmental and psychosocial stresses. So the idea that our environment, when it started off as the tiger running towards us, but is now the taxi spiraling around the corner, driving towards us, as well as the air pollution that comes from it, the noise pollution, the light pollution, the heat pollution, those environmental factors that cause our body to make a response. And in particular, something like air pollution, whereby fine particulate matter will transfer through our lungs, virtually through into our bloodstream, and with the potential to impact almost every cell in our body, meaning that there is this inflammatory response that is almost immediate and consistent with our exposure to things like air pollution in the environment, as well as hoping to explain that there are sort of psychological factors from society that cause us stress-related issues. And the reason I've kind of gone to this extent to explain that is because we can start to understand and make sense of this by mapping this on a page, for example, which is what we sometimes do to look at the relationships in environments and try and see, are areas more prone to increasing that stress upon the system, or are they not, as a baseline of understanding what is the environment that someone is in, and how do we use that as a baseline to ensure that we're making the appropriate interventions and mitigations to give them a good quality of life. So we did this with support of a big firm to do it for Great Britain, but it also allows us to go down to kind of micro levels and start to look at the different areas from space to space. But the reason I've picked that up, and this is kind of a crude drawing here, this is my own, so please take it with a pinch of salt, but it's a way of communicating that effectively we all will experience an environmental or a psychosocial stressor. I guess the big challenge is the people who are neurodivergent, so those in particular who are autistic and those with a similar, almost disabling element to their neurodivergence. Their sensitivity to that factor is far greater, but the longevity of that experience is also far higher. So whilst I would classify myself as neurotypical, I will find a commute very exhausting. I will probably get over it within about half an hour. However, someone who maybe on the autism spectrum disorder may experience that air, noise, light, and heat at a far greater physiological impact. And as well with the other sort of stresses, there is a longer half-life in the way that they will experience this, impacting their ability to even work in an office before they've got there. And so when we think about their urban experience in context of their kind of office-like experience, we've got to understand all of these baselines in order to actually appropriately understand the types of interventions and types of thinking. So I think it's important to communicate why health. Well, because it's a way of understanding that when someone's system can become dysregulated in this manner, that their sensitivity to things like poor lighting and the exposure of noise will have a longer experience in their body and then start to compound with other factors. And things can build up and build up and build up. And this is why we go again to the idea that our health is influenced by our environment, because if you are constantly exposed to environments that cause that triggering of that response, you are going to end up in a point. Now, I don't expect you to read all this, but it's a point of, I've provided it for slides later to be downloaded, but an idea of what's called allostatic overload, which is effectively the chronic exposure to those stresses causing a dysregulation of an otherwise naturally occurring system, which in this case, we talked about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this naturally occurring system that helps our body regulate our immune system, our metabolic system, and our endocrine system. But the exposure to all of those stresses chronically can cause a dysregulation of that. Once that dysregulation comes, we start to see more susceptibility to illnesses, more susceptibility to the onset of disease development. And there are high and strong links to the relationship between a dysregulated system and the development of non-communicable diseases. So we see a very clear pathway that actually, if we don't understand what we're doing, we end up almost forcing people out of workplace systems, almost out of society in their own different way, by almost disabling their ability to function in society normally. And one of the key things for those who experience a sense of neurodivergence is the feeling of burnout. So, for example, before I mentioned about the idea of masking, this constant need to feel that you have to pretend and put on a mask and hide certain elements, even though you're in pain in that moment, is actually a very physiologically stressful experience. The idea that you're both mentally stressing yourself out by the environment you're in. As you can see, a couple sort of statistics there to understand. I think this is a key function and an understanding of why people who are neurodivergent fall out of the employment system as such provided by larger organizations, I'm sure many of whom are on the call today. So we as part of our work for the BCO, we interviewed a wide range of people who identified with different characteristics within the neurodiversity movement, many of whom said that they were unable to work for long periods of time and left them with a huge sense of sort of almost self-deprecation and self-loathing. So we always try and base a lot of our work with people who live and breathe the experiences of kind of what we hope to provide strategy and insight around. So I think that hopefully gives us a good baseline so that we've covered what is neurodiversity and how do we understand its history and how might we think about the problem that we're trying to solve, and hopefully understanding actually what it feels like to, from through a lens of health, to be neurodivergent and to live and try and interact with a physical world and a kind of a social structure that causes you different areas of stress, and that surmounting and that building up of stress causes a response within your body that can lead you to be more susceptible to being ill, more susceptible to even the development of disease. There's unfortunately a strong relationship between people with quite acute neurodivergence and having comorbidities around things such as diabetes, obesity, and in particular with depression and anxiety. So I know it's not necessarily the most exciting thing to talk about on on a Wednesday morning, but I think it's a critical thing to talk about because it helps us understand the problem that we're trying to solve. I'm not discounting the importance of environmental comforts, which we all kind of know in kind of the wider workplace environment. I think the history of industrial engineering has talked to us about the physical ergonomic requirements to be able to function in an office well. And we do have certifications such as the WELL standard, which is looking at the quality of those environmental comforts, such as good quality lighting. I don't know if many of you will know, but certain LED lights, whilst they're energy efficient, are actually really exhausting on the brain. It is a sense of flashing that our brain recognizes. And whilst I'm not going to show it in this video, I'm going to provide a link to some work that actually the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, have done as a big employer. They have a program called CAPE, C-A-P-E, and what they produce a couple of videos to try and articulate from a first person perspective what it's like to work in those kind of environments. And you'll see that they've kind of done it almost like a video game where energy levels go up and down. But the idea that LEDs, whilst on one certification might be really good, actually they can be harming someone because your brain is constantly going flash, 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 and it's having to record that. Now, I said before that people who, for example, may have ADHD or are on the autism spectrum, their sensitivity to that is far greater. So their likelihood of experiencing a stressful relationship or even something like a headache that will build up over time. And something I've talked about building up over time is the idea of feeling alienated by this environment that you know intuitively that you're trying to mask yourself, but at the same time, you're trying to go, why is this like this? I am not the only person like this. I feel like this place doesn't understand me, and I feel like, and I'm going to use words others, they say, I feel like a freak, because they're the ones that's made to feel awkward while 99% of the people around them are handling it. And I guess that's the point of inclusion, is to try and understand those who may be excluded and work around that. So I guess when I'm talking about some of the recommendations and the relationship to the employment environment, I would argue straight up, there is great research from architectural firms, in particular going to things like the WELL standard, about those environmental comforts. I would follow them. But I guess, why would I be here? I think it's time to think a little bit more holistically about how development, design, and even employment systems can be more inclusive and understanding of people who are neurodivergent. So, like I said, I think Mark is able to provide this at the end as a link for you to download. It was something that we produced for the BCO. We were supported by PLP Architecture, an international firm based in London, to help us organize everything around how someone like yourself may access this work. So a lot of what I've talked about today is referenced in this piece of work, as well as a number of different sort of insights and structures. So albeit I've just noticed a typo on this page, what we've tried to do is understand that there are principles and recommendations and guidelines and regulations. We've primarily focused that report around principles and recommendations because there's people such as yourself who design guidelines for an organization or a way of practice, a guideline. I know, for example, that in the UK, the company Derwent London, a big office-led developer, have their own design guidelines around fonts and colors and other elements that bring the building to give it a signature class. Someone like us can't design those guidelines. There's people such as yourself who bring together a wide range of information to put together how that be represented. We also have kind of stayed away from the idea and don't believe in regulating the concept of neurodiversity because it is still an emergent space. And once we perhaps start to over-regulate, we fall foul. I think it's Goodhart's law that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be useful. And this idea that if we only focus on what's on the page, we forget actually why that measure was created, which is understanding the people in those situations. So in the report, I'm not going to spend too long on this because I'm actually get to some ideas, but it is trying to be structured so that if you're talking about placemaking, there are wider and bigger features to focus on. That gives longer descriptions and more acute understandings about what it is for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as autism spectrum disorder and its relationships to being in work. And we've tried to map out as well that relationship between stressors, and how the stress adaptation occurs and how it doesn't occur. It relates to different things that you might look out for in how someone's functioning at work. For example, it might be how you might design surveys with people, asking these kinds of questions. Are you feeling a sense of low self-esteem? Are you feeling loneliness? Do you feel you're working longer hours, etc.? I guess we're there to try and provide those insights so that you can make the tools that you need to do. So I guess I'm going to start to wrap up as such with 3 case studies about how to think about some of the topics we've talked about today. These are all, and actually these 3 have come from people we interviewed for the project. So I'm not going to particularly name and shame an organization. I don't think that's fair. People try to do what they do for the best reasons. But this is, very much the sort of entrance foyer du jour of modern architecture for office building. Let's try and make the ground floor reception area somewhere between a club with bad lighting, because it's normally dark in a club. You're normally in these places with techno music blaring around. And let's put the loudest cappuccino machine we can find echoing throughout the concrete. And the reason I bring this up is because this is kind of the exciting element of people going to work. And for many people it is. But someone that we interviewed talked about when they worked in a building, not this one, but very similar to this one, they, even when they didn't cycle to work, they would walk through the cycle entrance around the back. Because going through this front entrance just gave them the biggest headache onwards to migraine that they could find. And it was exhausting. And I guess the problem is that management weren't necessarily briefed too well about how people can use the building. And unfortunately, they were kind of told off. They were scorned for using the cycle access, even though they were just a pedestrian. They were told, no, you have to go in through your bike, no walk. And so they were forced to go through the front. And so instantly you have a design decision intersecting with a kind of facilities management / security condition that means that a person is now made to feel inadequate and inferior, as well as experience the exposure to noise and light pollution combining. And they said that this was just a place where they just didn't want to work anymore if that was how they had to work. And so I guess the very simple solution is that if you are designing larger environments, multiple access points of buildings, about giving people choice. This, this isn't an app that we're designing where you're trying to rush people through to the sales function. You're trying to provide work environments that are enabling for people to function as best as they can. Choice is important. So in many cases, a lot of advice around this topic of neurodiversity in the workplace will talk about the different choices for work. I mean, we do that with agile working or hybrid working, whatever we want to call it, giving people choice. We also have to think more holistically about, for example, giving people choice to access the building, given that we know these kind of factors. Another really important element is navigation. So a lot of literature will talk about the challenges that people who are neurodivergent will have with spatial cognition, the idea to map their environment in their head and to be able to turn left or right accordingly. Mark, I know I'm near the end of my talk, don't worry, I'm finishing very quickly. My younger sibling, Isaac, who's 24, is autistic. I've seen them fall into a near meltdown when they've walked down a train, sort of a train track at a train station, not down a train track, at a train station, going towards either two tracks, the platforms they needed to get to. And I'd given them instructions: go down, take left, go down the stairs, and then turn right. The dyslexia in their head got them confused. Then in that moment, they started to panic. That moment was, first of all, a physiological stress response. So we understand that experience is going to have a longer period to calm down, as well as then the feeling of inadequacy of just like, why can't I recognize these environments? And so navigation becomes really important. So when we start to think about workplace campuses, as well as workplace environments, or even just navigating how to get to a workplace, allowing people to be able to plan their route in advance is a huge supporting element to people who already do this in the disability space, as well as we can support people who are neurodivergent. So I would ask everyone who sends out an email to someone coming to their office building, why is it at the bottom of your email it doesn't say, if you would like some information about how to access the building and get to our office space, please click on this link? I mean, we kind of do that for a sitemap for a website. Why isn't there a sitemap for an office building or a campus, or even the district that building is in, allowing a person to navigate their way through so they are not made vulnerable and exposed in an environment? For example, I provided a clip, I think, of Matterport. You're already creating these visuals. The architects are, the developer holds them somewhere. We're always talking about data being this kind of asset that's in the built environment sector, but we're not using it. So why not use those CAD drawings more effectively? Why can't facilities management provide those support functions to people so they can plan in advance, they know they're secure, and they're not exposed to make them feel vulnerable? And the very last one, I talked about psychosocial stresses and housing inequality. I know we're speaking with an international audience, but I heard in many large cities, trying to get home is really difficult, living in cities. And many of us will know that you often have to kind of play a game. You have to, you're being played by a real estate agent. They're trying to convince you, you're not sure, you've got to play them. You're also playing the landlord, etc. You're weighing up your options. And unfortunately, people who do have some social characteristic differences within the neurodiversity space may struggle at this. And many of the people that we interviewed found it really difficult to rent a home because of the way that they interacted with the environment, i.e. the social environment or the socialized environment, and ended up living in poorer, I mean, as in lesser quality accommodation. They may be earning good money, but their quality of accommodation was really bad. Higher exposure to air, noise, light, heat. Maybe the area had high levels of crime. And I'm not scorning the concept of crime. That's a different conversation. But still, if someone fears themselves going out during the day, they may not be the target, but the exposure to it may be a perception of fear. Then that itself is a reason for someone to go, I don't fit into this. I don't feel well here. So what I've just kind of provided is an insight to, you provide this for senior executives, relocation consultants. We love, my mum still works in this space, and she forever is guiding people around places like London, and whether it be supporting young people moving to London from Singapore to work for Google DeepMinds, you know, they may come and go, oh, you know, I want to live in Shoreditch. And she's like, no, you don't want to live in Shoreditch. We're going to put you somewhere nice in Belsize Park so you can walk to King's Cross in the morning. Trust me, that's what you want in life. You don't want to live in Shoreditch. You want to go out in Shoreditch, but just get the cab home at night. And so here we have a very simple human resources, quality of employment condition, whereby you can support someone with this difficulty of trying to find a home. Doesn't cost a lot of money, but it can keep someone in employment for a long time. And I'm sorry to speak so crudely, but that arguably is one of the biggest problems that companies face, is people falling out of, or having to rehire, falling out of the workplace. So it's kind of a win-win-win in many ways. So those are the three things I wanted to focus on. I'm just going to end with that. It only works when you work as a team. That's why the solutions I've talked about have been quite holistic. It's about those meetings you have with everyone. It's about the conversations that you lead forward. You have to be a bit of an activist yourself. I'm not asking you to have banners and stickers everywhere, to have protests in or outside your office. I'm just asking you to talk with people and go, have we made the right decision here? Can we do a little bit better? So our 5 key learnings is that neurodiversity is a movement, not a diagnosis. Being neurodivergent does not equate to having a special skill. There are biological responses to these types of environments, and burnout syndrome is highly prevalent. And the concept of the physical office is part of a wider employment ecosystem. And really, interventions don't have to cost a lot of money. So that's my talk. Hopefully, we still got about 10 minutes. And I think I need to stop sharing my screen. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to make sure I don't end the call by accident. Ah, you've done it, Mark. Brilliant.
Done it. Yeah, I've done that. Well, thank you very much. I've got lots of notes, but there are some questions coming in. And yes, just for everyone, we will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with lots of links on, and an easy download link to the BCO report where you don't have to register with the BCO. We've got their permission to do that. Someone actually, Josh, mentioned one of the things that has been I've thought of as well. Things like hot desking must also be causing stress, not knowing what desk you're going to get when you actually get to the office.
Yeah, and that's double compounding. So something I led the writing of in the report is, yeah, the exposure to that hot desking, but also not having a fixed place of work means that often, and I agree with the concept of, I'm not sure if he's still there, but his name's just dropped right out of my head. I'm really embarrassed by it. Neil Usher was working with a company called, was it Space Go? It was about, you know, the premise of, do you need 100,000 square foot, or do you need 60,000 square foot of people in the building at the right time for the right purpose? And so it was an AI tool to organize people to be in the office for a particular function, i.e. not just sitting at a desk, but coming in for particular periods of working. I agree with that principle. It just needs to have a caveat to it. Because if you apply that to someone, for example, whose experiences many things I've talked about today, you're then either asking them to commute at times they may not know. It might be incredibly busy times. It might have challenging times. And all of a sudden you're adding a variable to people who do believe in order, because they need the order, because without the order there can be disruption. And that disruption can be, as I talked about, very disabling to people. So when you're talking about hot desking, you may find that someone may need to actually, even though they're being asked to hot desk, they might need to get there really early in the morning, and they might stay till late. And so you have to be able to account for that variable. And if that does exist, speak to people. You know, there's nothing wrong with speaking to people. I think I provided a link to a piece of work that Universal Music did, which I think we referenced once in the report, and it's much more about the nuances of interpersonal communication in the workplace around neurodiversity. It's a really, really good piece of work that an employer did. So again, we're seeing employers leading the conversation here, the BBC, as well as people like Universal Music. So in simple answer, yes, hot desking is a problem. But if we think about it kind of in a systems-based process, if you're asking people to come in at different times, you're changing the variables for them. So you still need to have some accountancy, some structure to ensure that some people, can actually just book something before someone else. I don't have the full answer, but I just want to impart, yes, And if we think about it that way round, we might have a slightly alternative solution to provide to people.
Great. I have a question for you from myself, actually. I hear some people I know say this wasn't around when I was young. This didn't exist when I was young. What's happened to it? You know, how would you answer that question?
I have to be very careful when answering this. So let's pick the straightforward, I think, responsible answer, and I'll give you a slightly more radical answer afterwards. So I think many of the references, in particular from the research field, is work that has emerged in the 1990s and 2000s. So yeah, I was born in 1985, so 1990s I was still a kid, 2000s I was an emerging teenager. My brother Isaac was born in 2000, and by 2004 it was very clear that he was understood to be or have a level of autism. So it's both a case of the diagnosis the assessment taking time to develop. And I think, truth be told, there were many people who were, for example, autistic or have ADHD, who would have struggled in life and maybe ended up in different conditions that they might not have otherwise today. And I'm particularly thinking about people who have ended up in challenging careers, challenging social lives, in particular, maybe because they have challenges with impulse control that relates to their ADHD. And so they may make sort of bad decisions frequently, which might mean that it's harder for them to stay kind of employed, and they might have fallen into I'm going to use the term because they're international people, but antisocial, i.e. their inability to function within the typical social structure. I'm not trying to be prejudicial. So they might have fallen into behaviors like excessive drinking, etc., because their impulse control wasn't there. And so what we might have labeled people incorrectly in the past of just being, you know, a bit bad, a bit wayward, a bit not there, actually was an underlying issue, maybe related to neurodiversity, maybe to something else. My slightly radical issue, something we talk about, and this isn't gospel, so please don't quote and take it everywhere. You can put a chart, basically the increase of use of petrochemicals and microplastics in society, and you can run that basically along the side of the number of cancers and neurodevelopmental issues, as well as non-communicable diseases, and you'll see a strong correlation there. I think we are increasingly being exposed to toxic chemicals that are causing a dysregulation, in particular to our hormonal system. So many people will be familiar with like endocrine disruptors, which are chemicals in things like deodorant spray, plastic packaging for food, carpets, for example, even in paints. And what they do is they mimic hormones in our body. So our body makes a response, and actually we produce too many of one thing and we cause a problem. And so we see this in particular in utero. So for pregnant women and people, their exposure to these factors can pass it on to their children. So I think the slightly more radical issue is that we're dealing with environments that are kind of causing this problem more and more frequently because of the toxicity of our environment. So that's our opinion. That's not gospel just yet. There are people who talk about that, but I would just kind of pass that comment on. That's something that we look at quite broadly around issues, but not necessarily its direct relationship to the neurodiversity space.
Great, thank you. Damien asks, it seems like we're heading rightly to individual needs being incorporated into the workplace, but what methods can help deliver this? Maybe that's not your bag, but is there a method that helps assess people's individual needs?
I don't know if Damien's referring to a tool. I don't think so. I guess it's not really about absolute individual needs. It's looking at decisions and trying to kind of walk through them in a kind of user experience process. So it's a kind of when you get to each stage, ask yourself 3 questions. And I think, guess that's what this piece of work and this work is about, is being able to ask yourself, at this point of what we're doing, have we done enough? Are there any risks? I think that is the main thing that this work is centered about. It is not about hyper individualizing the experience of work. I don't think you can ever do that. I want something different to probably you, Mark, and I hope I speak correctly. I don't think either of us are neurodivergent. Well, I'm not. We're relatively neurotypical, so you can't go down that line. It's understanding perhaps how certain people may be more exposed and made more vulnerable. I think that's the point of today's conversation. I would always recommend the role of survey design, but survey design not particularly about work, but the experience of functioning within workplaces, and it's just a slightly different way of approaching it. You don't want to lead people down a particular answer to get a particular answer from them, but yeah, I think the role of good psychoanalytic survey design that's done with the right level of ethics is the right tool, even if it's pre or post kind of design in that way. If you're looking to do interventions, nothing is wrong with speaking to people. You just need to know what kind of questions to ask. To know what kind of questions to ask, you need to know kind of what problems you want to solve. I think that comes back to the original intent of this conversation with you guys, is to understand the problem and kind of go forward from there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I always say that it is about choice and being in control of that choice as well. And I think that for all of us, it's like, I might make the choice that you think I'm going to make, but I'd still like to make that choice. Anyway, so great. Some of the solutions you mentioned are low cost, but in your experience, is manager open for longer investments towards neurodiversity? Where is the longest scale win for the company?
Crucially, I think you're talking about retention of employment, if you're being really capitalistic about it. I don't like the idea of the talent war, because again, you're starting to stereotype. That's our personal dislike, and I think many in the neurodiversity space will dislike that, but that is how some are perhaps incorrectly working at the moment, when they think, well, we have to retain people and attract people for employment, so if we don't think about these things, they're not going to come here. That is one way of thinking about the problem. So I would argue it is about the retention and retainment of people in employment and the attraction of people. I don't see the things costing that much money. You can speak to a lot of people that don't really need the most intense lighting system. It just needs to be slightly more humane. I think I picked that word. I hope I've kind of answered that question. I think fundamentally for the company, whether it's the developer who really cares about how long their tenant is going to stay there, or the employer who's got an environment and is trying to make suggestions to management, fundamentally it is conversations that hopefully lead to people staying. I think we all know it costs 2/3 of someone's salary to rehire them. That's a standard sort of metric. There's an easy savings. If you're paying someone 150 grand a year for a very sophisticated role and they happen to be neurodivergent, that's 100 grand a year, just about, saved. That's an easy savings when you relate to it, going, let's just have 5 meetings with everyone over the next year.
Yeah, and you highlight one of the challenges that when it comes to leadership and businesses is often the answer's a number, isn't it? And once you start talking about those numbers, that is what's going to persuade people. We're at the hour. Josh, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone's questions, but we will give you Josh's contact details so that you can contact him. Josh, thank you for a fantastic session. Great, thank you very much. Joseph asks, are you aware of any new or better lighting technologies or strategies rather than LED?
I'm afraid I'm not with enough expertise to be able to answer that. I think we have referred, I think PLP did some good research into that for the work. It may be recommended. I can't answer that. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry to let you down. It's just not my area of specialism.
Don't worry, we will find that out, but it's just Thank you. Stephanie asked, do you think return to work mandates are discriminatory? If I am ND and have this perfect setup at home, is it fair to ask me to work in an environment where I cannot be at my best?
A really big ethical question here. So, in the talk earlier today, I mentioned, I think, a mutual contact of ours, Neil Usher, who for a period of time was, or is still related to, I think it's Space Go AI, which talked about using AI to ensure that, asking the question, do you need 100,000 square foot of an office, or do you actually just need 60,000 square foot with the right people in the right space at the right time for the right activity? And so do you actually have a waste of space? Do you just need people in for the right task? And I think there's a merit to that. I think we should really genuinely use the office for the right conditions. So I would say a return to work is, well, like, what's the conditions in which someone's coming in for? As a blanket rule, no, I don't think people should be in there 5 days a week if it's really just sitting at desks. Equally, I think 5 days a week of constant meetings, I don't know, that's a good culture of work anyway. Me personally, no, I don't think I'd ever take a job again. I mean, I run my own business, but I wouldn't take a job again that asked me to work 5 days a week. I don't think it is appropriate. I think that's the also balance about this topic, is that nothing is hard and fast. It's not an exact rule that everyone will get sick. It's about the weight and load that we can put on people. And so if there is a return to work mandate that's asking people for 3-4 days a week, you go, okay, cool. But can we start to talk about some of the affordances that might make that journey slightly easier for me? So can we make sure that there is ample hot desking available, so I could get in at 6 o'clock in the morning, which maybe means the building needs to be open earlier. So the security guards need to be briefed that maybe some members of companies are going to be coming in earlier because they need to avoid the rush hour. And so it's about the conversation that takes place. And I think hopefully what we've provided in our work is supporting those conversations taking place. I think that's the best way I could hopefully answer that conversation. Oh, sorry, that question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Brian emphasizes the challenge, which he says that the office workplace experience begins when you leave your home, not just at the office entry door. So highlighting that challenge as well. Rebecca asks, with the mix of hypo and hypersensitives in play, would you say that purposeful variety accompanied by flexible place policy is the best starting point?
Yeah, you've answered your question very acutely and articulately. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts or suggestions on engaging users in participatory design processes?
Yeah, I find it really interesting in the UK in particular, almost like the lack of engagement with representation organisations. So when I think about like urban planning, for example, I see very little influence by labour groups in what's the reality of how people maybe on lower to middle income are working. And so when we think about whether an intervention in the urban environment is good, it depends on really, are certain people are working at night where that's going to be influential or not? And I think the same here, that in the UK, Autistica, who are a leading organisation, I think every employer should be knocking down their door going, can you come help us set up the strategies needed or work in a community of organisations if we're small so that we can set up the right representation groups? I think there are already groups out there that you can reach out to. I think they are the ones with the intimate expertise to do that. My encouragement is yes, and I would say that there are specialists to do that. Just start Googling or using Bing, whichever service you want to use, to find those local groups and give them a call. Universal Music did a very good piece on that, and I would recommend having a look at that and then kind of moving on from there.
Great, thank you. Someone called Hawks actually mentions that what you're talking about really relates as well to the education sector. So, and that's the point. A lot of it is just about space, isn't it? So,
well, yeah, I mean, we see it in models of education, of the Steiner model and Montessori education, which can be, far more activity-based learning. So we've already applied it to education for children, away from the almost like draconian Taylorist form of education, which is make people study so we can move them around the world. So yeah, I think it's a good example. We already apply it, and I think that was something that I wanted to put at the beginning, that we already have come to a way in society where we've done this work collectively. And so all we're doing is continuing what's always been done. It's just improving things. So we don't have to feel that all of a sudden we're entering a completely new thing and everyone's new and it's all scary. We've already been doing it as a group of people. So I would say, don't be scared.
Great, and hopefully everyone's reading the chat, because there's some great observations there. But I guess our world is furniture, and someone's asked a furniture-related question. Is there a furniture setting that better supports a neurodivergent person, or even a setting that definitely doesn't? Like thinking about, like you've been thinking about the two entrances into a building. Have you had any thoughts about this?
The only thing I can relate to, from my knowledge, is and I don't know how much work you might have done to those who live with dyspraxia and how they may approach the concept of comfort. I think that's quite fundamental. Something I'll bring up that's kind of related, it's maybe more towards your kind of floor-led design. One of our kind of advisors at University College London, Professor Nick Tyler, who, whilst he's a civil engineer, likes to call himself a civilized engineer. He runs two large-scale physical laboratories, one called Pearl and the other one called Pamela, the Pedestrian Access Mobility Engineering Lab, and then Pearl, the People Environment Accessibility Reality Lab. Conveniently, I think he's got a thing for Golden Girls about that, and he likes to make that little joke himself. But what he's doing in there is looking, for example, at the musculoskeletal impact of how we walk on concrete all the time. Concrete is, our bodies are not meant to be having that hard exposure, that hard impact, and that is having an impact on our systems. So he's looking at that. Well, what are different surface-like materials that we should be walking along to support our musculoskeletal development? So for those who may have some challenges around that, for example, people who are dyspraxic may relate to that. We may even see things like flooring design be more supportive of our system. So I would say that, yes, from two angles, I could say that there is definitely furniture that could be improved. I don't have that answer, but that is the demographic in which you could speak with. But also, secondly, we can look beyond furniture and look even at flooring and carpet design to look at materials that may be softer on our systems.
Great. And what we might do is also add to the follow-up emails some work that was done for us by Dr. Sally Augustine as well around neurodiversity. So that might be of interest as well. I'm going to make this the last question, and thank you for the hundreds of questions that have come in. It's very hard. But one I'd like to, that often I think about when I'm walking around some offices, how does colour affect us? Are neutral colours the way to go? And then someone else has always commented, please, no, not all neutral colours, so it's, what does colour play?
Yeah, two sides. So I guess if you want to get like very, very utilitarian and kind of like William Morris on things, that, nothing nothing useless can be truly beautiful. So color for the sake of color is not very helpful. And I think designers, people that I've mentioned before, and I think people mentioned this list, so architectural firms like HOK and consultants like K Sargent will talk about the overload of color, the incorrect use of color in design, and it's over visual stimulation. So you kind of have one thing of, if you're using it for the sake of it, all you're doing is creating visual noise. However, in a very simple way, color can be used to help visually map and identify a place and a space. We see this in shopping malls, we see this in airports, etc. Any of you who've been to London, or I think they've taken it away now, but at Old Street Underground Station, because there was a special eye hospital nearby, they had on the floor a whole series of lines that helped lead people to the eye hospital as well as to other places, because they recognized that people with visual impairments may not be able to identify where they're looking around. Where's the sign in this underground metro station that says for the hospital when there's 5 exit points and thousands of people walking backwards and forwards? And so there is a way in which color can be very useful. Color can be useful to identify exits and entrances, etc. The overloading of color and pattern is a great way to give someone a headache. I'm trying to remember I think it's those who may be more dyslexic can also apply for the inability to distinguish sort of linear boundaries. And that's where color can be useful. We see it on staircases. Often the lips of stairs will have a different color. That's because they can blur into one, and people's depth perception can be challenged in that way. So they may miss a step. So I'd always argue that color should be useful. From a mood point of view, it varies. There is a lot where color can be useful to mood. Everything has to be in coherence, and I think that's a key word, something I think we talk about in the piece of work about an environment making sense. So if you're just in a room that's the blue room, it's a bit stupid, to be honest, because why is this room blue? Is it just trying to make me calm? That may not be the solution, and I think that's why it's important to always have conversations. So color, yes, an overload of color can be too much. Use color for distinction. I would say be calmer on color. And I think if you look at any branding and sort of advertising campaign, 3 colors is what you need. Make sure those palettes work together and they can fit into a design. So hopefully I've commented on that in the way that people might have wanted to hear.
Josh, thank you very much for a fantastic session. I really appreciate everyone joining us today. And Josh, thank you very much for some great insights.
Thank you very much for inviting me.